Welcome to Coffee with Kusari. I'm Ben Cotton, and this week I'm joined by Nigel Douglas, Head of Developer Relations at Cloudsmith. Nigel, you and I did a webinar last week, and the link is in the show notes for people who want to go back and watch that. Um, I thought it was great. It was a lot of fun doing that with you. What's sort of the one takeaway that you would want people to know if they haven't watched it yet?
Yeah, I mean, we started off on this premise of the Department of No and just about moving away from legacy practices. And some of those is, you know, discovering or isolating a security threat that we initially identify and then spending a lot of time triaging it afterwards. I think the one take home we'd like to get around this is that that is obviously a legacy approach to security. If we can get more detailed analysis in the isolation stage when you actually focus on whatever that threat is, but also give the information back to developers so that they can do something now as opposed to waiting on security to respond. Yeah, that is ultimately where the industry needs to be going.
Well, so as an industry, we've talked about DevSecOps for a long time, and it's been how many years since the Phoenix project was published? Why are we still having this conversation, do you think?
Yeah, one of the reasons I can think of why the industry is still approaching this is because it's organizational structures. We still have a case where security teams or auditing teams will say, these are the processes I want to implement, these are the tools I want to be using, and it doesn't really align with developer efficiency. This is one of those things where there needs to be better communication, I believe, where devs can work with security as opposed to working in a silo.
Yeah, I have a definite bias towards that kind of answer. One of my favorite classes when I was in grad school was an organizational change management class, and we talked about technology almost 0% of the time. Um, like you said, I think there's a lot of, you know, security is not a technical solution, it's an organizational and human solution. What do you think is sort of the next step to get us down that road?
Yeah, I mean, one of the approaches is like fundamentally understanding what developers are doing and trying to better align with whatever they're doing. So when we look at cloud native as a concept or a methodology, it's all about efficiency and it's all about shipping things fast. That's not the only reason, but again, when you're talking about these orchestrators and scaling quickly and things just working automatically, the same logic should be applied to security practices as well. It shouldn't be this thing that's done on bolted on the side. It should be a case of, look, if you have an automated practice around orchestration of containers as an example, then you should also have like automation or orchestration of security policies and security decisions. Not so that the whole thing's automated and humans aren't involved, but rather so that developers, when they make an instant decision, that something is instantly coming back as feedback so they can go, okay, that actually makes sense. This is why I can't progress, or this is why I'm held up now. But I know that this is only going to be a temporary blip. It's not going to be something that I come back to in 24 hours and we've made no progress.
So tell me quickly, how does Cloudsmith fit into that vision?
Yeah, so one of them, I mean, if I start off by just to quickly explain what Cloudsmith does, we're an artifact registry solution. So, all software dependencies that come from your open source upstreams, we put those into a central store, which is your artifact management platform. This registry is a place where you, as a developer, are going to fetch these software packages. Now, how where we play into that whole efficiency and avoiding the bottleneck around that Department of No is that you can define policies that actually work with development workflow. First of all, these policies are, developer as code, no different to any other sort of, when you think of using Terraform to automate something, think of OPA Rego as our way of saying, look, these are the things that I want set controls around, so you can be quite granular about it. But you can also use it so that the decision log that developers ultimately interact with in the end will give them all the rich information they need to say why I cannot use this thing right now. You might not be allowed to use it because of exploitability risk. It could be a generic CVSS score assigned to it, or it could be a licensing conflict. It doesn't really matter what the thing is that you're setting the rule around. It's just that you give that information back to developers so that they can ultimately make the decision. I'm not going to progress with this software package for this reason, as opposed to we just found that there's a vulnerability in a package and you're not allowed to use it. That's not really helpful right now, and you're actually holding up the whole progress. So the other day, Ben, we were on that webinar, and you showed us an interesting score system that was coming up from Kusari. I know there's a bunch of different scoring systems today. This might be yet another scoring system. I just maybe there's a way that you could explain why this is different and what's the benefit of this additional metric.
One of the first questions that anyone ever asks when they're responding to a vulnerability is, where is this vulnerable library or vulnerable package in my software? And the next question is, all right, so what do I do about it? And, especially for companies when, you're first really starting to get your hands around your entire software supply chain, you find a lot of vulnerabilities. They're nested many layers deep in your dependencies. You've got a lot to deal with, and you can't fix them all at once. So, how do you prioritize them? There are things like the CVSS that rates the severity. It's supposed to be somewhat objective. There's a lot of, debate about how useful it is as a metric. But it's something we can work with, and people like it because it's objective and it gives you a number, and then you can stack rank based on that. And severity is important, but it's not the only factor, right? If you have two vulnerabilities with the same CVSS score, and one is used in one application that's internal facing, maybe doesn't even have network connect, like a internet connection in production, and the other one's in 20 public facing web apps. The 20 public facing web apps one is going to be more important because that presents a bigger risk for compromise. And so what the Kusari score does is it takes into account not only the technical severity, but also the breadth across your environment, and really tries to pull these different facets together to help people understand which ones are the most important one, which ones we need to knock out now, and then what do we move on to next. Because, the idea of zero CVEs is great, but really what's important is zero relevant CVEs, and reducing that risk as fast as you can. All right, so let's shift to the future a little bit. And by the future, I mean next week as we record this. KubeCon North America is coming up. What are you looking forward to there?
Yeah, I mean, for us, there's a few things we're excited about that we're actually hosting ourselves, thankfully. One of them is that we're taking part in the Cloud Native Rejects. So we're not necessarily hosting that event, but my colleague Esteban is giving a talk on SBOMs. And I think it's got to this point now between the European Cyber Resiliency Act, and you see in the US, they've had an executive order since 2021 around SBOMs and basically their place in society today, which is that they're more and more becoming a thing you have to have as opposed to an optional technology. So I'm really excited to see how Esteban's talk comes out. But then a day later, I'm actually organizing a captured flag activity. And again, it ties back to these things like vulnerability scanning, SBOM analysis, really giving the users the tools so they can go in and say, okay, this is what I'm expected to do, but also making sure, does this align with developer efficiency? And the best way to prove that is through a captured flag. Like if you were up against the clock, could you respond to these incidents efficiently? Or is it a case of, look, you're stuck in the ground? And I think from those two events that we're organizing or involved with, I think they're going to be the things I'm most excited about. But obviously, there's a whole bunch of different talks at KubeCon around technologies like cosign, technologies or projects that we're using that we're also going to keep a close eye on, because ultimately we're also an enterprise platform built on a bunch of these projects, and we want to see what are the latest and greatest advancements here.
Yeah, and I'm particularly excited for the return of Open Source Security Con as a co-located event. I know in the past there was, trying to make security conferences a little more of a standalone thing, and going back to what you said earlier, right? Like we need this constant interaction, and we need developers to understand something about security. We need security to understand how developers work. We need the platform engineering teams to understand both of them. We need everyone to be able to make that collaborative effort to improve security, and having events co-located, I think, is a great way to get those sort of interested but not interested enough to make a trip for a dedicated conference, kind of people, and get some of that cross collaboration.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's also, it depends on what your role is fundamentally within an organization. We can sometimes simplify that someone's doing Kubernetes. What does that mean? You might have a dedicated focus on observability and monitoring key metrics, these golden signals in your organization. Understand, are we spending too much? Of which a co-located day around observability makes so much sense for you and your role. But the same way, if you're DevSecOps and you're doing just nitty gritty security stuff, then a dedicated co-location is just a great place to socialize, to network, to really understand what other people are facing, the problems they're reaching out to. And then it's also just a great place to get ideas. So when you go to the main conference, one of the things I always find is you're overloaded with the topics and list of talks that are going on, and it's hard to prioritize. And I think meeting with other people before the actual main conference is a way to say, these are the 6-7 talks that I'm actually going to focus my time on.
Speaking of socializing, are there any parties or social events that you're looking forward to in particular?
Yeah, again, there's one of them that we're hosting with Cloudsmith and with some other vendors, and that's the Appray Cube. I think that's going on. Speaking out of turn now, but I think it's on the Wednesday night. So that's definitely going to be a lot of fun. So if you are watching this before KubeCon, then of course come over to the event. And if you're watching this after KubeCon, I hope you got a chance to go to our Appray Cube event.
Thanks for joining us today, Nigel. If somebody wants to follow you or follow your work, where can they find you?
Yeah, there's a few places. The main one is the Kubernetes community Slack. I've been still quite active in there since my days working on the Falco project within the CNCF. So I'm more than happy to answer questions directly via Slack. We're trying to be more active on Reddit. So we've more or less brought back our Cloudsmith subreddit. So again, it's a great place to maybe ask questions, to engage with the content we're publishing on a regular basis. Is definitely encourage that. And then there's always just things like LinkedIn. If you happen to be on Professional Network and you have questions, or you want to keep up to date with what we're doing, feel free to reach out, and happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Well, thanks for joining us this time, Nigel, and we'll see you all next time on Coffee with Kusari.